so I've included 2 backing tracks for Bolivia. The first features the backing for the actual tune itself, but then for the solo section, it just stays on that G7 vamp. Because for a lot of people, that would be, there's enough to think about just within the context of that G7. And you can work with all the language I've talked about playing on that G7 chord. For the more experienced improvisers, I've also included a version that has the full chord changes of the whole sequence in it as well. And they're quite tricky chord changes. Some of them seem quite unrelated. It's quite a challenging sequence to improvise your way through. So I'm now really addressing those people who are very familiar with their major and minor scales and are familiar with the notion of chord tones and guide tones and things like that. But I'm going to try and help those people negotiate a way through improvising over the full sequence. Now, when it goes into the A section, its first chord is this kind of E flat major 7, then it moves straight to an A7. That's a seemingly very unrelated chords. They're a long way apart harmonically. But Charlie, the pianist from the NYJO Ambassadors, talks very, very well about this in his little segment of the educational video that runs in parallel to our performance. Where he talks about voice leading from a pianist's point of view. So when you're comping on this tune, providing a harmonic accompaniment, he talks about using the top note of the right hand voicing and moving as economically or as kind of short a melodic distance as possible each time that the chord changes. And what that does is it helps to kind of smooth out this otherwise quite kind of awkward progression and make it sound very lovely, very, very pretty. Now, pianists think in those terms all the time, but as single melodic line improvisers, it's perhaps not quite such a natural process for us. But we still have to think in those terms when we improvise, because it really helps us to understand the harmonic progression in our ear and also to convey it to the audience in a very clear and kind of effective way. So the way in which you can do it when you're practicing is very, very uncreative, first of all. Simply pick one of the chord tones of the first chord, the E flat major 7. So the chord tones would be the root, the E flat, the third, the G, the fifth, the B flat, or the major 7, the D natural. Or even better still, pick one of the guide tones, which remember are the third and the 7th, which are the 2 most important of the chord tones because they really dictate the tonality and the function of that chord. So pick either the G or the D. And don't try and be creative with it. Just play it as a semi-breve or a minim, however long the harmonic rhythm dictates. And then when the chord changes, try to move to the chord tone of the following chord, the nearest chord tone of the following chord. Remember, some of the chord tones of the initial chord will be in common with those of the second chord, in which case you don't need to move at all. Just remain on the same pitch if it's common to both chords. But the general idea is to try and move as little as possible throughout the entire sequence. So for example, if I started on, let's say, the 7th of that first chord, the D natural, and then when it moves to the A13 chord in the following bar, I'm going to move down a semitone to the C sharp. So I start on the D natural. You could do this with a metronome. I'm simply doing it free time. And then I'm going to move, for the third chord, it goes to a D major 7. I don't need to move at all. I'm already on the C sharp, which now becomes the 7th, which is one of the guide tones of the C major chord. So I'm going to remain on that pitch. Then it goes down to the A flat 13. Again, I'll go down just a semitone to the C natural because that is the third of the A flat chord. Okay, so I won't demonstrate all of them, but that's the process. And I would go through the whole progression like that, either alone like that or with just a metronome or even free time, and then possibly with the backing track so I can hear it more in the context of the harmony of the tune with the bass line kind of underlying it. Okay, so that's the first process. The second stage of the process is to introduce a little more creativity, to improvise a little more, but still not too much. Okay, so this time, take a short little motif, a little cell of music. It either invent something or borrow something from the tune. That can be quite effective. A really short little cell, 3 or 4 notes, let's say, and then try and transpose it through each of the chords in the context of the sequence. Okay, so let's say I'm going to borrow something from the tune. So I quite like that. That happens in the third bar. So I'm going to take that. It starts on the 7th of the chord and then works its way down the chord tones, eventually arriving back on the 5th. So I'm going to take that shape and then play an approximate version of it. It doesn't have to be absolutely note perfect all the time, but I'm going to take that little shape and try and transpose it through each of the chord changes. So if I start on the E flat major 7, so I'm going to start on the 7th of that, which is the D. Okay, that was to the A chord, and now okay, I lost my way a little bit. It's a tricky process, but it's a really, really useful one because it gets you, again, hearing those chord changes, hearing the relationship between them, and using a melodic device to negotiate your way through them as well. And of course, transposing a line like that is always a very, very useful process because it's something that is relevant to performing in all kinds of jazz contexts. And the third process I'm going to suggest today, which is kind of a development of the second process, is to stick with that motif initially, but then wander a little more off-piste, so divert away from it, returning to it perhaps quite frequently. Okay, so you can still have it there as a kind of safety net to come back to, but not only as a safety net, it can be quite a good sort of creative device to keep returning to kind of common thematic material, known as kind of motivic improvisation. The likes of Sonny Rollins employ it a lot. So take your motif, wander away, be more creative now, so improvise more in the true sense of the word, but still keep returning to that motif. So this sort of process. Okay, so I was just starting to improvise a little bit more, be more creative, but still using that essential motif as a kind of springboard for my other ideas.